Great to see everybody. If you haven't already, go ahead and take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, and then if you're affiliated with an organization or a certain role in the community, feel free to include that as well and get a sense of everybody who's in the room. I will introduce Erica Sarova, our speaker, in just a moment. You'll probably notice you are muted. If you are not muted, please make sure you are muted during the presentation. Feel free to ask questions. Typically we save questions for at the end, but if you have questions where you need clarification along the way, feel free to go ahead and put those in. And then, like I said, we have been wrapping kind of a lot of content into these community learning sessions, so we try to include enough time for the presenter, but also some time for Q&A and discussion afterwards. So please just be mindful of time. We want everyone to have a chance to participate, but try and keep your comments in the kind of 1 to 2 minute window if you can, so we make sure everyone who wants to engage has a chance to. All right, thank you everyone for putting in your introductions, getting a sense of who's in the room. And now it is my privilege to introduce to you Erica Sarova, who is our speaker for the day. We have the honor of having Erica as part of our team for the backbone team of the Success Partnership, but she works for NMSU as the director of the Center for Community Analysis. And gosh, there's so much we could say about Erica. I'm just going to read off her bio here, but I think those of you who know Erica know there's a lot more to say than what is just in a brief bio. So through her work at the Center for Community Analysis at NMSU, she does surveys, assessments, and data analysis along with her team. She works to centralize, analyze, and disseminate data to the community to improve all of our abilities to make more evidence-based decision-making and increase our collective impact as we all do our work. Erica created the education context report for Doña Ana County. So there's been 2 of them now. If you haven't seen the one from 2020, which covers education data across the prenatal to career spectrum for Doña Ana County, I'd highly encourage you to check it out. Their website is cca.nmsu.edu. She's also conducted gap analyses on early childhood education for the Success Partnership. She's helped develop and analyze several surveys for partners in the Las Cruces Public Schools, but also all throughout the community. If you've been involved with resilience leaders, you've seen the data work she's done there. She's worked with PED. Erica and her team in the Center for Community Analysis have their fingerprints all over the state doing really wonderful data work. So it is my honor to welcome her. She's worked in education for almost 20 years and has master's degrees in both sociology and geography from New Mexico State University. Welcome, Erica, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate you all attending. So I wanted to start off by posing a question, so I'll just share my screen really quick. I thought we could have about a 5-minute discussion about the schools that you went to as a child. What were the demographics like in your school? Were they composed of children from a similar background as yourself, or was there a diverse range of students in your schools? And that could be anything. That could be language, religion, race, ethnicity, economics, whatever you can think of. Just stop. I don't know how. Oh, there it is. Sorry, how to stop share.
Okay, I will share. Hi, everybody. My name is Vanessa Knox, and I'm the Family Engagement Coordinator with Engage New Mexico. And I am of the African American persuasion. And I grew up in a town where my family was the only black family in the whole town. And it was a little town in Kansas called Wamego. I'm sure nobody's ever heard of it because it's that small. But yes, I was the only Black child in my school and, like I said, in the town. So yeah, so I had strange hobbies like raising rabbits and showing cows and stuff like that. Not typical. But
that's great, Vanessa. And do you think, can I ask you a question about
Sure.
that? Thanks for sharing that. Do you think that have you ever thought about how that affected you, or how that, you know, maybe changed your, just the way you view the world or education or anything like that? I don't know if you've.
Absolutely. That's a great question, Erica. And I can honestly say it completely changed my life because before my dad joined the military, we lived in the projects in Dallas, Texas. So, and my dad joined the military to get us out of that situation because we were in very poor schools. And so when we moved to Kansas, I was a challenge to a lot of the teachers. I had that, Southern slang, and I didn't speak proper English. I said ain't a lot. I remember they used to drive them crazy. So they were very much into proper English, and thank God for it, because that is, a lot of people say that I make an excellent public speaker, and I have to give that to the education that I received in Kansas, in that community.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for sharing that.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any experiences?
Hi, Erica. This is Josie Carmona. I'll share, I had a similar experience. I grew up in the Texas Panhandle. I was one family of maybe 2 or 3 Mexican families in a predominantly white community, oil and ranching, and then the Black community. So I lived between those 2 worlds. And even up until about 1993, our community was very segregated. There was a Black pool, a Black Baptist church, and a Black community center. Now, since I've left there, it has become, there's been a bit more diversity, but it was pretty much on the binary of Black and white. And it definitely had an impact.
That is very interesting. So I'm sorry, where was that again?
The Texas Panhandle, right outside of
okay.
Amarillo. Little
Wow.
town called Worker.
Thank you so much. That's really great. Just to hear the diverse experiences of people. Anyone else? We could probably do one more person if they want to share.
Senora Flores has her hand up.
Oh, okay.
Yes, hi everyone. I grew up in East LA back in the early 60s, and I went to Catholic school. It was about 70% Hispanic and 30% Anglo. I remember sitting in the classroom and seeing a girl with blonde hair, and I thought her hair was spun out of gold. So that was my experience, okay? And I was a second language learner, so I think I got on the honor roll by 2nd grade, so they did not punish me or anything. So I guess I was lucky.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Okay, so let me share my screen. So the reason why, oops, one moment. Still trying to learn PowerPoint and Zoom presentations. So the reason why I asked about the school composition is I'm going to talk today about how the composition is related to student outcomes. And a lot of you just, pointed to that, just even if it's not academic outcomes, it's who you are as a person, and how school composition is also directly related to school catchment zones, typically, and talk a little bit about the history of segregation in public schools and desegregation, and then look at Las Cruces public schools and maps of not only the school attendance zones, but also the neighborhoods demographics within those zones. And then, like Lori said at the end, have a discussion, but feel free to pop something in if I have a lot of stuff to cover, but if feel free to stop me at any time if you have any questions. So as many of you probably are aware, back in 1954, the government declared that segregating students based on their race was unconstitutional, and it was mostly talking about the South and the segregation between Black students and white non-Hispanic students. And then the government commissioned a study by a sociologist named James Coleman. And this was important study because what he found was that the social class composition of the student body was more related to academic achievement, independent of any individual student's background. And since then, there's been mountains and mountains of research on this very topic, looking at the impact that school composition has, and also the relationship between school attendance zones. So one famous study by Schwartz happened in Maryland, and they did an experiment where they took students that were, children that were living in high poverty housing, government housing projects, and they took half of them and they randomly assigned them to low poverty schools, and then half of the students they left in their neighborhood school, which was very high poverty. And what they found at the outcome was very similar to what the Coleman's research said, was that the composition of the school really impacted the outcomes of these students more so than their individual background. So why is this so? So school integration, they found, promotes more equitable access to resources. So often they'll find that if you have these highly qualified and very experienced teachers, they tend to gravitate towards the higher performing schools, or the schools that are low poverty. High poverty schools typically across the United States have fewer math programs, AP classes, college prep, and other types of classes. And then also just the effects of, if you go to a school where there's children from many different backgrounds, you learn how to cooperate more. You learn how to build consensus and collaborate with people who are different from yourself. And then also a lot of sociologists point to the different social and financial capital that parents from that have higher incomes bring into a school. So, the norms that establishes. So, for example, a school that is very low poverty may have a lot of professionals. Those professionals' parents may have already have college degrees typically. They know how to navigate the education system. They know how to navigate and advocate for better programs within their schools. And even equally important is that if you have disparities in housing or in your neighborhoods, those are typically replicated in the schools. And so a high poverty school is going to have a lot more financial needs. They're going to need more counselors, social workers, and other types of services. And when we look at the maps later, you can, I think it really exemplifies that. Like what's going on in your neighborhood is often what's going to be happening in the schools that are in that catchment zone. So throughout the 50s and 80s, there was desegregation programs that were that the federal government was overseeing, and it was typically the schools in the southern states, although some of it was happening elsewhere, such as California. There was a lot of different desegregation programs, especially with they had what they called Mexican schools at the time, where a lot of they were sending the migrant workers. But the typical tools that they used to desegregate the schools was busing students to different areas, redistricting. So that would be drawing the district boundaries differently, like between, say, Gadsden and Las Cruces, and then shifting the school attendance boundaries. So that would be changing the boundaries within a school district. And then later on, magnet schools. So the height of really integration programs was really 1988. And then things started to take a turn in the 1990s and the 2000s, and there was numerous different court hearings, but I just put two of the big ones here. And the one in Oklahoma had basically ended the federal oversight of desegregation programs in the United States. And they gave that control over to the local entities and the local school districts to decide if they wanted to continue desegregation or just come up with their own programmings. And then the second one was in Seattle. And or not the second one, there were numerous, but one of the big ones was in Seattle, and that was in 2007. And so Seattle School District was using race, a student's race and ethnicity to decide which school the student would attend. And the reason why they were doing that is because they were trying to integrate their schools. So they were using it as a way to bring children together and have a better balance throughout the school district. So a group of white parents were upset with that because they didn't want that to happen. And they fought and they actually ended up winning. And so that was incredibly important, because what that meant was that the only tool really, or one of the only tools really left, was to be looking at redistricting and school attendance boundaries. If you wanted to, make sure that your schools were balanced economically and racially. So because of that, things kind of went haywire. Schools started rapidly becoming becoming segregated. And just between 91 and 2012, increased by over 40%. And the issue with that is often the students that are in the high poverty schools are typically children of color. And this is pretty much across the United States, and it continues today, that you're much less likely to be in a high poverty school if you're a white non-Hispanic child. There's been a lot of calls across the United States and a lot of academics saying, and the government, Obama touched on this as well, to really start refocusing on school segregation and thinking about how we can make our schools more integrated. And again, the outcomes, if you're a low-income student attending a school with low poverty rates, you're much, much more likely to attend college than if you're attending a high poverty school. So I probably should have mentioned, this is, a lot of the research in here came from when I was getting my master's degree. I did my thesis on school attendance boundaries in Las Cruces Public Schools. So I had reached out to them back in 2016 to ask them about how they decided on how to construct their boundaries, their attendance zones. And it's pretty much the same as you see across the United States. They're looking at the students and the ages of students in the different neighborhoods. They want to create an enrollment balance. And I know that they're in the past going through their documents and talking to people, that they do have looked at the racial and ethnic balance between the schools. They also look at traffic and transportation and natural boundaries and housing and birth rates and so on. So it's a very complicated process. And I know that, I believe there's a few people in this room now who have been a part of that process and have been a part of those conversations. So it'll be great to hear from you, but so that's typically what goes on, and it's very similar to other places across the United States, unless there's some schools that are really into integration may do it a little bit differently. So after the district appoints a committee, and then the committee decides, makes recommendations to the superintendent and the school board. Citizens are also a part of that committee. And ultimately it's the school board's decision. Now, at the time when I was living here, I've been living here for almost 20 years now. And so I remember the different schools, the rezoning process when schools have been added to the district. And then when I was doing my research, I was going through a lot of the newspaper articles and things like that. And I had remembered like how the conversation quickly started turning to high school athletics and music and the band programs and less about, topics of equity, which I think is very natural. I think it's a very hot topic, talking about adding a school and how you're going to change the boundaries in it. And it puts a lot of pressure on the school district, the committee that's doing it. And then you have a lot of family members who, want their children to stay in whatever neighborhood school they're in. So yeah, it can be a very complex and difficult process. So looking at Las Cruces Public Schools, these are the elementary schools, and this is showing the rates of economically disadvantaged children. And so in the district average is this gray line right here. And so typically when you want to measure segregation, or they'll often call it a diversity index, they look at how closely a individual school mirrors the district rate. And so here, you see the district average in the elementary schools is 56%. And we have these schools that are very low poverty by comparison: White Sands, Desert Hills, Sonoma, Monte Vista, Highland. And then up here at the top, these very these high poverty schools. And so Booker T, Conley, Valley View, MacArthur, Hermosa. And if we look at the Latinx population, 79% is the district average. And then we have some of these exact same schools, Sonoma, Hillrise, Desert Hills, White Sands, with much fewer Hispanic students. And then here at the top, these schools that you saw in the previous slide that are also tend to be very high poverty as well. So not unusual. This is often what you'll see in many school districts that haven't, especially the ones that haven't been under federal desegregation orders, I should say. So the relationship between academic proficiency and the poverty rate, I think many of you have seen this graph before, but me and my team put proficiency in reading on the y-axis here, and then students on free and reduced price lunch, which is our proxy measure for poverty. And what you see is as the poverty rate increases in a school, the proficiency rate is very low. So some of these same schools, like Booker T. Washington, don't have as high proficiency rates. And then this up here is White Sands, Missile Range, Desert Hills, that have very high proficiency scores. So I, again, looked at the diversity indexes and this was back in 2016. So the data was a tiny bit older, but we haven't had any new schools since then. So there's no reason to think that, the demographics have changed drastically. But the testing showed that if you wanted to have the students be evenly distributed throughout the district, you'd have to move almost half of the students who are economically disadvantaged, and 27% of students would need to be moved in order to create a racial and ethnic balance between schools. So I'm just going to click on some of these, one of our maps. So we just finished, some of you may have seen our previous map, and we just updated this yesterday on our website. And so this map is showing you the school demographics and for the individual schools and their school zones. So you can hover over some of these and you can see, can you see it all right? Sorry, I can't see your faces. Do I need to blow this up?
Just a little bit larger,
Okay.
be helpful. That's better.
So thank you. So in here, and I think Hallie was going to put it in the chat. And thanks, Hallie did a lot of extra work helping get this ready today. But you hover over the school points, that's the location of the school, and you can see the different demographics. And then you can click over here and it'll show you which school it is and its location and its catchment zone. And then down at the bottom here is that same graph that I showed you. So if you want to have a look at this, you can play around with it. You can change it to middle school or the high schools. And you can also change this to look at whichever demographic you're interested in. So if we look at economically disadvantaged, we see Rio Grande Prep, much more so than the other schools here. And elementary schools, you see some of those same patterns here. I'm sure many of you, if you live in Las Cruces, are familiar with these areas of town. The housing is much different in these areas than here in the downtown area of Las Cruces, much higher poverty rates as well. And then the other map that we put together, this is showing you the demographics, the city demographics. So this is mostly Census Bureau data or data from the New Mexico Community Data Collaborative. They put together a lot of demographics, and then I just built the maps from some of the variables that they already had in there. So shout out to the New Mexico Community Data Collaborative. So this map is showing you children under 18 living in poverty by block group. So if it's lighter colored, there's less poverty. And then the darker the color, the higher the poverty in the different neighborhoods. And if you change this to, let's put child abuse victims. So these are the rate of child abuse for children that are 1 to 4 years old. And you see here, if the darker the orange color, pardon me, the higher the child abuse rates, and then the lighter, the less rates. We change this to drug overdoses. Red, more drug overdoses per 100,000 people. This is a rate, and then the bluer, the less drug overdoses. So if you look at this, and you can keep doing this and just taking more variables and putting them on top of each other, and what you find is that those maps very much start looking very similar to each other. And so, the theory is it's logical that if you're designing schools and your schools are only catching students in a certain neighborhood, that if there are issues happening in that neighborhood, then you're going to have, again, like the research says, a lot more needs in that school. So, so solutions or things to think about is, considering very carefully the neighborhood demographics when you're rezoning, thinking about inclusionary housing policies. So a lot of places in the cities in the United States that have been successful at integrating schools, they've also used housing policy. to break up their neighborhoods so that their actual neighborhoods aren't so segregated. But I also wanted to mention, also are making sure that our schools are representative of the populations that we're serving. And so that we're celebrating the culture, the diversity of our community. We have, and I think Las Cruces Public Schools is really doing a great job at working, and all of us doing a great job at trying to think about, how do we increase bilingual programs in all the schools? How do we celebrate student culture and indigenous culture? And I think about Raíces del Saber and the great work that they're doing and how they can be a model, and how our schools can be more inclusive within each school. And then also just looking at, different policies that create barriers within schools, even if those schools are integrated. How do we make sure that the students who are in them have access to the same programming? So these were a few questions that I thought about. I'll take any questions you have or things to discuss. But one thing that really came up for me was, the Go bond that's coming through, and thinking about creating low-income housing, apartments, and buying BLM land, and how, what effects could happen if we do that, and where are the students going to go to school? Are we, even if we do integrate the schools, is everything going to be completely equitable within those schools? Should we consider redrawing the boundaries? What are the benefits of being in a school where everyone is similar in background, which may also have some benefits, and then being in a school where there's diverse backgrounds, charter schools, private schools? That's another reason, not in Las Cruces, but in the United States, why there has been a big proliferation of segregation, has been because of private schools and charter schools popping up. And so lots to think about, I think, as a community, as Las Cruces grows, and we think about housing and how we're going to move forward, and so on. So I'd love to hear, answer any questions or thoughts, ideas.
Mike had a question in the chat.
Yes, the feeder schools. Again, yeah, I forgot to add that. Thank you, Mike, for adding that. That was also been, I know, an important factor when determining in Las Cruces and elsewhere the catchment zones, is how to think about the feeder schools and where the elementary schools those children will go on to. But what was this? The mandatory nature dwindled.
I would defer to Senora Flores for a lot of the detail related to this.
Mm-hmm.
But when I retired back into the Cruces area, Jesse Gonzalez was superintendent at the time. The board was ambivalent at best, says me, and seemed to be trapped in this feeder school. Start them in this elementary school. Because they went to that elementary school, they will go to this middle school, and they will then go to this high school, almost disregarding birth rates, sex numbers, social trends. We seemed at the time to be very trapped in the dogma of the feeder schools and the district boundaries. And then then we began to change. We began to get smart around 2010 by just saying, no, we're going to erase these lines. They're not really stuck because we like this idea of magnet programs. And sure enough, for one, being the male role model in a family of a single parent mom and watching those two girls come up through the system and then bang, the magnet schools came. It was like a searchlight went on. Every kid that I talked to loved the idea of the magnet program. The parents, not so much, because bus schedules and parents' working schedules and locations were essentially non-player considerations. But the school district adjusted and to the benefit of the students, says me. But I'm just wondering if is that a consideration in the research or just a footnote in terms of the historic value of it? Because there was nothing, there's nothing in those days in terms of the racial and the social.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the magnet schools, but I do know a little bit, and it seemed as if it does help to integrate schools, and that my understanding was that was its primary function, was to help integration, but that it wasn't quite as effective. And I think it varies place to place. You know, obviously, if you're in New York or Chicago and LA, some of the bigger cities might have really strong. So I think the quality of the program also really matters. So yeah, but yeah, I'm not sure, but I would love, thank you, Mike. That is a good point. If Senora Flores, I'd love to hear, I know you were a part of the board on some of these processes, so I'd love to hear what you're thinking.
Thank you. Just things that we considered important at the time. The last time we did a redistricting, one was transportation. The other one were the activities, and we were putting in the 4th high school, so that the activities became very important. The other thing that the district or the board members cared about is walkability, especially for the elementary schools. Each school level has its own distinct needs. So if you're talking about elementary, you want them walking to school as safely as possible, but the activities have to do with the high schools. And then the last one was tradition. We have tradition in Las Cruces, and that was a big battle for a long time with the high schools because they wanted them to play on the same teams that their fathers and grandfathers had played with. Do the GIS companies that we use in helping us do lines, they do not consider these things. These things come out in the community. The parents will come up and say these things. But what happens so much of the time is we followed those guidelines from the company in Albuquerque, and yet we still got it wrong. One of the main things that we cared about was that it be equitable, that we have a certain amount of students, different kinds of students in each and every school. But you have to move them around a lot to get that sometimes. And then it becomes a problem. Then it becomes a problem of transportation. And when Centennial opened, one of the big things that happened is students were placed at Centennial, but they could look out their backyard and walk to Las Cruces High. Centennial did not have transportation, public transportation available. I still don't think they do now. I had been fighting for that for a long time. And now now they realize that it was a mistake to move kids that can walk to Las Cruces High to Centennial because they dropped out and then they went back to Las Cruces High. So there goes the equity right out the door. So those are the kinds of things. There are so many variables, and sometimes you get it from the experts, sometimes you get it from the community. You have to listen to everyone. And
Right.
even still, in our elementary school, there's one that the school is considered is run by a very good principal. She is Latina. And yet there is all kinds of problems of racism within the
Mm.
parents.
Mhm.
So how these are all issues that just bubble up over and over again, and how to make, and so there in that particular school, the opportunities are just not the same because
Yeah.
it depends on the parent and who can vouch for their student.
Mhm.
So I have no
Absolutely.
answers, but it has to be, the one thing that bothers me is that we put it off and we put it off and we put it off instead of facing it head on and taking care of each and every one of these issues. And we still don't get it right. But that's my experience.
Thank you so much, Senora Flores. Cheryl, you've had your hand up for a while. I want to make sure I give you the chance to talk as well.
Hi, thank you very much. Excuse my camera off. I'm driving to another meeting. But I really appreciate the conversation, and I know it's hard to get educators, involved in the conversations when they happen during the day. But as a retired educator, I just wanted to add that it is really hard to make those groups. Teachers make groups and teams all the time, and as soon as you put different kids together, then you realize what was maybe a bad idea about that group, and it's a work in progress, but really appreciate when we have a variety of thoughtful stakeholders that make that decision. And really include people's voice. But I was just going to say, I was at Conley Elementary 32 years ago. It was my school. And right about that time, it was really changing as far as the economics of that district. And I don't know if any of you are familiar when Conley was the outskirts of the town. And it was really, the most eastern, one of the most eastern schools there was. Remember before Roadrunner? And I was there right when it really changed, and it shifted to a rental district rather than a home ownership district quite as much. And there was some huge economic shifts, and then there was housing projects that were built there, and it really, you could see the changes in test scores and various things. And at the time, I don't think people really thought about that. And there was a lot of finger pointing at the time as far as why those shifts were happening. And so I just think it highlighted that the points about these critical conversations and why we must always talk about equity and these economic factors, because they shift and it can lead to some real negatives or upset people or lack of conversations when we really just need to, make sure we're putting it all out on the table. So I appreciate this conversation a lot.
Thank you, Cheryl. Are there any other questions or comments for Erica?
I have a general question that probably doesn't have an answer. I'm curious as to what you all think about, I really appreciated what Senora Flores just pointed out, like as having been involved in the process as well. And Erica, just this is the complexity of it, right? It's almost mind-boggling, the things that you take into account. And then Senora Flores talking about kind of the unintended consequences and all these lessons that you learn. And I'm just curious about, what you imagine the role of community to be in this process, because it's, the responsibility is the school districts, but it also seems like, especially in our work here, so the Success Partnership is about a community's collective impact and this idea that education is a shared responsibility, right? So in that regard, it seems really wrong to just say, this is school district's problem, you're responsible for doing it right, and no one, community has to play a role in helping to make that better. And I think about because some of these issues that were brought up, that Cheryl brought up and that Senora Flores brought up and that Mike brought up, there's not necessarily any like right answers to, right? And so like there's what the school district can do on its own, but what is the role of community in this process?
Lori, this is Maria again. I just wanted to say that one of the things that Erica pointed out was housing policies. I think that really is a place that would help improve, like the center of Las Cruces. If they did a small regrowth of housing, improved housing, perhaps to improve the inner city schools. I think housing policies are very, very important.
That is a
There,
great point. Thank you.
there's a saying, housing policy is school policy.
Right.
Yeah, I agree 100% on that. And I'd also like to just say, also, I think just lack of knowledge on the importance of integration and the subject matter. So,
Yes.
And racism, and having topics about that, because I think that's really important and often overlooked.
If I'm not mistaken, I think this happened maybe last summer. There was a couple of articles in the newspaper about the city wanting to build affordable housing west of US 70, and there was a huge uproar from the community there. So this goes back to housing and how that affects school districting and all that.
Yeah, the people always complain about these kinds of things. But one of the difficult things with the schools around Highway 70 is you don't want to cross that road. You don't want to have small children crossing that road, and what might be equitable in the end becomes sort of impossible because of the highway there.
Not safe, right?
Right. Do we have, yeah.
Envy memes.
Not in my backyard.
Yes, got it. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
So one more. God, Erica, sometimes I wish I could just like engage you all day long in these conversations, but I'm thinking about our county again, because that's our focus. And like, so with Hatch, it's a different story, right? 1,200 students, there's only 4 schools to begin with. That's districting there is a different conversation than districting in Las Cruces, where there's a much bigger demographic area than 24,000 students, give or take a few. And then Gadsden, you've got like what, 13, 14,000 students, but it's also a much more, in a lot of ways, it's a more homogenous demographically, right? So how do these, like, I'm just curious with you all at CCA, what are you seeing in terms of the data with Gadsden or these school districts where the demographics are more homogenous, and how does districting, what's the conversation there?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. And, typically we, at least data-wise, we're seeing better outcomes as if you're looking at test scores and graduation rates in Gadsden compared to Las Cruces. And I think that, that's again where like I think the acceptance of school, of the diversity of students and the culture of students and serving the needs of your population, where, the importance of bilingual programs and I see in Gadsden, and just being, in my experience working with Gadsden, when I was running a free tutoring program, they were very open to having people come in and helping tutor students or do anything they can, to help students. So I think that there's something to be said for that as well. And that's why I mentioned like the importance of bilingual programs, the importance of celebrating culture and making schools a place where, the social studies standards and the culturally relevant curriculum, where all that comes into play, that if we're really working towards that and we're making our schools more welcoming, that's that's also just as much a part of the conversation, including with integration. But I think my point, with the presentation is we don't necessarily, if people understood the importance, we could cross Highway 70. We wouldn't have to do it that way. Or we can think about, just doing things differently. And I know a lot of districts have done that. And I think this is where education as a shared responsibility comes in, is if parents are even more aware, if the community is more aware of these issues, then maybe that helps change the mindset of people, and that it becomes less about the football team and more about equity. But it's complicated. So I also acknowledge that.
Thank you, Erica, so much. And thank you to everybody who has commented and shared their thoughts. It is a very complex issue, and we certainly won't be solving it today, but this is the point of having these community conversations, is beginning to talk about solutions, how we can come together and combine our efforts and change what is, because it doesn't have to be this forever. So with that, I would like to close out our session today by thanking Erica and the Center for Community Analysis for this incredibly eye-opening presentation, and to everyone who shared their thoughts. And if you shared anything in the chat, we'll definitely include that in the minutes for today's meeting. And I would also like to share with you our upcoming community learning session is going to be Wednesday, April 13th from 2 to 3 p.m. We'll be hearing from Dr. Timothy Hand, the Chief of Staff for Las Cruces Public Schools. And the topic will be experiential learning, learn by doing. And the Zoom link for registration will be dropped in the chat. So you can open that up and register for it. Thank you all so very, very much for your attention and your participation today. It's greatly appreciated, and we hope we see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.